Here I am working the very last side of the very last row of the torso below the armhole area. So now we're just about ready to divide the work and begin working the back separately from the front to create the slits that the sleeves will go into. But before we do that, we've got one more step to complete, and that is to confirm the true row gauge of our knitting. To do that, I'm going to make myself a little tool. You can just do it with a ruler, but this is very helpful. Using the grid on the table, I have created this cross, and that is just to help make sure that we get a true square, not a trapezoid. Now I'm going to put the camera down and draw a 1-inch square centered on that X. Now I've trimmed it just to make sure that the extra won't be in the way. And this will be our tool, and I'll turn it over and write 1 inch on it in case I want to save it for the future. You can make yourself a bigger window, and actually I recommend it if your knitting is large enough to allow you to lay down a bigger window, but mine is not. Now, with the knitting relaxed, and that is critically important, we lay the window on it and see what can we see through that window. I already knew I had 4 stitches per inch, and that confirms it. 1, 2, 3, 4, the little V's. It almost looks like they're not quite fitting in there, but it is because of the angle of the camera and the shadow. And now I'm counting rows up. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 V's going up. Have a look here. You have to make a judgment call at the bottom V. Yes, this is the very bottom of the V, but it's also the top of the other stitch. So you adjust to how much probably belongs to the top stitch and how much probably belongs to the bottom stitch on the average. And this is why, if you had room for a 2, 3, or 4 inch window, you would get an even more perfect measurement. For example, say I used a 4-inch window and I got 25 stitches. Let's get the calculator over here. We would simply divide the 25 stitches by the 4 inches that I knew I had used, and we would know we had 6.25. And any slight discrepancy from not eyeballing the very top of the stitch and the bottom of the stitch correctly is divided by that 4 inches, so it becomes extremely minimal. Whereas in a 1-inch measurement, any error is in that 1-inch measurement. However, that's nitpicky. I don't mean to worry you. Generally, this is quite good enough. And I have a good 5-inch, no, I said that wrong, 5 rows per inch measurement to base my armhole on. Here's where our perfected row count comes in. We absolutely want the opening for the sleeve to be the correct size. For the little mini newborn sweater that I am knitting, I need 3 inches of length. My row gauge was 5 per inch. 3 times 5 is 15, so I need to knit 15 rows on the back alone. What if it was 5.5 stitches per inch? Multiplying that comes out to 16.5. One must round either up or down, and I almost always go up at 0.5 or greater stitches. Actually, I would probably have gone up even if it was 16.4, because I think easing in, I think it's better to go up rather than down, basically. 3 times 6 equals 18, so if your row gauge is a perfect 6, you would have done 18. So that is my target number of rows. Now the pattern, Kiss Your Kids, includes sizes from 20-inch chest all the way up to 34. Obviously, the target lengths, which are included in the pattern, are different. and it gives you all of those lengths times these same row gauges. Or you can opt to say, I want to get the mathematically perfect amount. Let's clear this. And we will say you have determined, because you're quite particular, that you're getting 5.7 stitches per inch. So we will multiply 5.7 times the length of your armhole. We'll say you're making a bigger sweater, and it's 6 inches. There we go. There's a great example. You should knit 34.2 rows. You cannot knit 0.2 rows, but the 0.2 is such a small portion. At that point, I would probably knit 34 rows. However, it's a judgment call, and as you get more experience, you will learn which way works better for you. Honestly, the difference between 34 and 5 rows is, in most cases, not going to be a big deal. Perfection is good, but absolute perfection is not really necessary to get a good sweater. Looking at our little diagram, we finished that. It's our ribbing, and we have knitted up to the pink dot, all circular knitting, so there are no seams here. Now we're going to divide the work and knit up to the green dot, and we are first going to knit the back, which is straight knitting. Here is my initial yarn tail, so I know this is one corner, and my back can either be knitted on these pegs or on the other half of them, but it does need to start with one side of the back aligned with the yarn tail. This is an area where you do get a little bit of a do-over almost. If you look at your knitting and there's anything that you don't like about it, an uneven stitch, a flaw in the yarn, any little thing you're just not sure about, but it isn't bad enough to take apart, orient that spot so that it's on the back. I didn't have anything that worried me very much, so I'm just going to get started. But believe me, it does happen, even to experienced people. If you're perfect, ha ha ha, which I am not, the yarn isn't. So we're going to start knitting from this point, moving to the right. I'm going to knit all the way around the corner. You can mark these stitches with stitch markers if you need to, but honestly I don't feel that you do need to, because after 3 rows it will become extremely obvious where you're working and you won't make a mistake. I'll show you that. Alright, this is half of the pegs, thus half of the stitches, and I'm going to knit back and forth on mine for 3 rows so then I can show you how easy it gets in a minute. I've knitted my 3 rows, and I want to show you this is in the middle of the 3 rows, and this is how it normally appears going around a corner. Your yarns are right there next to the pins. Now here is the side of the back. See this dip beginning to form? Nothing I could do now would make those yarns snug up to the pin where I see a direct wrap from peg to peg around this pin and to here, because several rows are making a slot here. That's exactly what we want, and that's why you won't get confused with or without a yarn marker. Let's look at it one more time. Yarn going straight around, a slot beginning to form. So it's not as hard to keep up with things as you might think. By now I've knitted 5 rows, and my slit is really developing and becoming obvious, and I want to show you one little thing. Sometimes when we are working a knitting pattern, we slip the first stitch at the beginning of the row, which would mean just skipping it, not wrapping it, not knitting it, beginning like this. We do not wish to slip the first stitch for this project. The main reason being, it'll make an easier, neater seam to go ahead and wrap and knit it. There is no fanciness required to knitting the first stitch on a kit. So you see how easily it wraps. However, if you find it easier or neater, you may do it like that, which is a half hitch. That's the real name of a type of a rope knotting technique, and it does make your stitch sit on there, well, your future stitch, neatly and wait its turn. But either one works, and I would encourage you to choose one and stick with it. They look slightly different, but they'll be hidden in the seam, so it doesn't really matter. However, it's going to be easier for you to seam if you've been consistent. I have finished my 15 rows, and here is what it looks like now. This is one side of the armhole, but of course, since we still have work on the other side of the loom representing the front of the loom, and I have not knitted the armhole there yet, it's doubled up, so it doesn't look very big. And here's a sketch of what we've done. We completed our ribbing. We knitted a tube up to the underarm, and here is what we just did. We began here, and instead of a tube, we knitted straight up the upper back, shoulder, neck, shoulder, and here's the back of the armhole. These are separate areas. This will be seamed, this will be seamed, and this will receive part of the neckband. However, we don't really have to designate that right now. When we align it with the front, everything will become clear. At present, if you knitted sizes, let's see, 26 and up, you have to do nothing more right now than bind off. And I'll show you in a moment my suggested bind off. If you are knitting one of the baby sizes, as I am, you do want to determine which is the left and the right and take care about binding off from that point. I will include that in the next video so that those who are not working baby sizes can just skip it if they want to. So right now, let's bind off. If you're an experienced knitter, use any bind off that you assess to be a good idea. If not, try this one. It's the transfer bind off with a little change. I am breaking all our KISS rules, and I wrapped around the peg. And lifting the two loops over. I now transfer the newly made stitch to the next one over, leaving that wrap around the peg. Wrap around the nearest peg to the stitches that I'm now binding off. This one's done. This pin, is just holding things for me. It's not doing anything else, and in a moment I will release it and you'll see. Over. Transfer the stitch. To do that stitch transfer, go behind the pin as always. Wrap around the pin against all of our normal rules. If you need to lift these over one at a time, that is okay. Same effect. Lift, go behind the pin to make the transfer. Wrap around the pin and the peg, make a new stitch, and so on across. Why am I doing this, you may wonder to yourself. And it is because we will get a really even bind off that is firm enough but does not distort the shoulder by pulling it in. And for a new knitter, it can be very helpful to let those pins hold things for us, because it's it's making certain that the size of each bind off stitch is consistent, which is quite important to the eventual fit of the neckline and shoulder. You can see that if it's too loose, you could conceivably tidy it up with your shoulder seam, although it would be a lot better if it was just right. But if it's too tight, your shoulder is going to pucker, and your neckline is not going to fit right, period. We need that neckline to stretch enough to go over the head, and yet we don't want it to be sloppy. So this little trick accomplishes all that. This is called the transfer bind off, whether you work around the pegs or not. And when I'm working by myself, I don't work around the pegs. I can make it even without that, and I'm much faster without, I keep saying pegs when I mean pins. I apologize. Of course I work around the pegs. We all have to work around the pegs. But I wouldn't normally use the pin as a spacer for myself. And if you are very experienced, you probably won't need to either. But these videos are aimed at people making their first sweater, and the help might be very good for them. Also, people who have manual dexterity problems, maybe caused by arthritis or something, and have a hard time telling when they've got the tension equal, may find it a good tool forever. Now I'm going to stop here because I need to cover the left side in the next video that is for those who are knitting shoulder flaps for babies. If you're knitting a tab for a baby sweater, join me now in video 5. Otherwise, you may skip to 6 if you want.